Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about the number one heart risk factor that your doctor never checks. When it comes to heart risk, most people think about cholesterol. And yes, it is an important marker to look at, but not the way that they typically measure it. We are not really interested in total cholesterol. There's really no correlation between total cholesterol and heart disease. Instead, we want to really start looking at the indicators of inflammation, low-grade chronic inflammation. And there's several things we can look at on a blood test, such as CRP, C-reactive protein. That's a good indicator of general inflammation. We can look at HDL, high-density lipoproteins, and if it's too low, that typically indicates that there's some inflammation going on. When inflammation drops, HDL tends to rise. But even more importantly, we want to compare HDL. We want to measure the ratios between HDL and total cholesterol, HDL to triglycerides. And there we can start seeing if there's some inflammation going on. We also want to check the LDL size, because if the LDL particles shrink, now that's an indicator of inflammation and oxidative stress. But even though these markers of inflammation that are super important are hardly ever measured, there's one marker that's even more ignored, and that's called homocysteine. And why should we care about homocysteine? Because even though it is a normal metabolite, an excess amount of homocysteine is linked to all sorts of disease conditions, such as vascular inflammation. Remember the heart disease and stroke? We have it linked to cognitive decline. So an early onset of dementia can be linked to homocysteine. We also have miscarriages linked to homocysteine, as well as infertility and even osteoporosis. And I'm going to get into some detail on this, but I'm going to break it down in simple terms so you really understand what homocysteine is, why it is so important that we understand it, and how to fix it. So when we eat protein, it consists of amino acids, and one of those amino acids is called methionine. And methionine, in turn, as we process it, it gets broken down into homocysteine in the liver. And this is a perfectly natural step. It's not a problem unless this process gets stuck at homocysteine. And if it does, now the levels of homocysteine start accumulating and reaching high levels, and now it can cause all those diseases that we talked about. But there's three different ways that we primarily take care and get rid of homocysteine. The first one is that we simply recycle it and turn it back into methionine. The second one is that we turn it into something called cysteine, which is an amino acid that is a very important building block. And we can also bypass homocysteine by turning methionine into cysteine via another pathway. And if this pathway works the way it's supposed to and doesn't get stuck, now all is well, because cysteine is super important for the liver and for detox, and it is the main building block for glutathione, which is the body's number one antioxidant and free radical defense. And there are many different ways that this process can get stuck, and we're going to talk about several of them. The most important, perhaps, is if you have a genetic variant in the gene that makes MTHFR, which is an enzyme that makes this recycling process move forward. And if you have that genetic variant, what happens now is that you have a reduced capacity to perform this recycling. So you basically stop to different degrees, and we'll talk about that as well. Some people have a severe reduction and some people have a moderate reduction. And if you have that gene, now your homocysteine levels are very likely to start building up. And the third way that you can get rid of homocysteine is through the kidneys. You can simply filter them out. And as long as you have normally functioning kidneys, then the third step here is a non-issue. It just works the way it's supposed to. Whereas with step number 1, it depends on both the genetic variant and certain nutrients. And step number 2 depends on certain nutrients. But as long as you have healthy kidneys, then this is basically out of the equation. It just does what it's supposed to. So MTHFR is a gene, and it's very common for us to have genetic variants where it's not working as well as it's supposed to. And you could have a heterozygous, which affects about 30 to 40% of the world's population, or you could have a homozygous that affects about 10 to 15. And heterozygous means that you have one gene affected. So you get one from your mom and one from your dad, basically. And if one of them isn't working, then you still have one that is working. So your capacity is shut down a little bit, but not too severely. However, if you're homozygous, then both the genes from your mom and your dad are affected. They're not working as well as they should. And now you are severely affected, that your tendency for homocysteine to build up is going to be much higher. So if you look at those numbers, you realize how incredibly common this is. That we're talking about 3.5 to 4.5 billion people in the world that have this genetic variant where they're not converting homocysteine properly. And one easy way to remember this MTHFR is that if you sound it out, you're going to notice that it sounds a lot like a very common profanity. And it's not named after that profanity, even though if you have a MTHFR test or you have a homocysteine test and you get back results that are not what you wanted, you might be tempted to call out this particular profanity. But it isn't actually named for that. It is named because of the letters they spell out: methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. And the ACE here means that it's an enzyme that we make so that we can turn folic acid into the active form called 5-MTFH. So the only way to really know if you are affected is to do some testing. And there's two things you can test, which is you can test the gene itself, the MTHFR, and you can run a specific test for that gene. Or if you do your entire genome, then that is going to be included in the test. And the other one you can test, of course, is homocysteine. Now, which one is better to test, so to speak? Well, if you test the gene, the MTHFR gene, now what you're measuring is your tendency to develop high homocysteine. It doesn't tell you if you have high homocysteine, it just tells you the probability that you would. Whereas if you measure homocysteine, now you're measuring the actual function. You're measuring how well your body is actually converting it. And this is based on a lot of other variables as well. So I think it can be great to run a complete genome and see what your predispositions are. However, just to find this out, I think it's much better just to measure the homocysteine, because that tells you in this moment, at this point in time, how well you're doing. And if you get the test back and it's above 15, then it's going to get flagged by the labs. It's considered very high. You're at high risk, and even the standard labs are going to flag it. If you're a little bit lower, between 10 and 15, you're still too high. You're still having significant risk and a tendency to inflammation, but at this level, it's not going to get flagged because that would flag almost everybody. If you're between 7 and 10, you shouldn't worry too much. What's what we call borderline, but you still would do well to bring it down just a little bit. And between 5 and 7 is where most functional doctors consider it optimal. So let's look at how the different variants of MTHFR could affect the homocysteine levels, because just because you have the variant doesn't mean that you necessarily have high homocysteine. So we're going to look at 3 variants. If you're homozygous, both genes are affected. You have two genes that are underperforming. If it's heterozygous, one gene is affected, you have one that is underperforming. And if you're normal, then all of them are working the way they're supposed to. And these numbers are not written in stone because there's lots of variables, which we're going to talk about. But typically, if you're homozygous, you'd probably get a value between 12, which would be too high but not flagged, and 20, which is significantly above the level that gets flagged. If you're heterozygous and everything else is good, you may not get flagged at all. You could be in the borderline to the slightly high level, whereas if you're normal and everything else is good, now you would be in the optimal range. So this is kind of an ideal situation where the only problem you have is that there's a genetic variant. But you also need some specific nutrients for your body to be able to convert this homocysteine into something else. So if you have nutritional deficiencies, that's going to reduce the ability regardless of what your genetic variant is. So if you're low in vitamin B2 or riboflavin, that can affect it. And if you're supplementing, you want to make sure that you get the active form that's best utilized called riboflavin 5-phosphate, or for short R5P. Another B vitamin is B6, also known as pyridoxine, and the active form is pyridoxal 5-phosphate, or P5P. So again, if you're supplementing, you want to make sure that you get these versions because then you're not getting any bottlenecks in using them. And one of the most important is vitamin B9, also known as folate, and the active form is 5-MTHF. And of course, you notice by now that that's the same first four letters as in MTHFR, and that's because that's the enzyme that converts folic acid into the active form MTFH. And the fourth B vitamin is B12, and you want to make sure if you supplement to get the active or best utilized form called methylcobalamin. So now let's get back to the table that we started, and we looked at the variants where this was kind of an ideal scenario. But now if we tack on some nutrient deficiencies, the homozygous is probably going to be much higher, like 20 to 30, or even significantly above that. We've measured some of these in the high 30s and even 40s. Now, if you're heterozygous, you have some compromise, but now you also don't have the raw materials for your body to work with, so you're probably going to be a good bit above that range where you get flagged. And even if you're normal, if you have nutritional deficiencies, you're probably going to find yourself with a homocysteine level that's too high. So that's with the nutrient deficiency. But what about other factors? Can they influence this? Well, absolutely, because you have organs and body parts that are supposed to perform this work of converting. And if they don't work, if they're not fully healthy, then they're not going to be able to take those nutrients and perform the conversions either. And the liver is the most important because it actually does most of these conversions. So if you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and or insulin resistance, and these two very often go hand in hand, now your liver is not going to be at full capacity to perform this conversion of homocysteine. And we mentioned before, the third important pathway to get rid of homocysteine is through the kidney, to flush it out. And if your kidney has a dysfunction, then that could be a very, very big factor. So again, if your kidney is functioning normally, then it's not an issue. It's not a factor in the equation. But if you start getting down to half of your filtration capacity, or even lower or close to kidney failure, now this could become the most important factor, and this could bring your homocysteine levels sky high. And dialysis doesn't even remove homocysteine all that effectively. And next, excess alcohol is a burden on the liver that's going to keep it from functioning at its best. And then there's several medications like metformin, PPI drugs, and antacids. And PPI stands for proton pump inhibitor, which means it's blocking your body's ability to make stomach acid. And this, along with a poor diet, or separately even, can affect your body's homocysteine levels. And if you are a vegan, it is super important that you make sure you get plenty of B12, of the methylcobalamin, because that's one of the most common deficiencies in vegans. And if you're low on B12, that could jack up your homocysteine as well. And if you recall, it's the amino acid methionine that gets converted into homocysteine. So if you eat an outrageous amount of protein that contains methionine, then you could actually develop an excess that way also. So if you have one or more of these factors as well, that could bring your homocysteine levels up even higher. So if we go back to this table again, we were already at very high amounts, but if you add one or more of those risk factors, now you can probably add another 10 to 20 points. And this is why, even though we're supposed to be between 5 and 7, oftentimes we can see levels of 30 or even 40. And in cases of kidney failure, we could even get up to 50 or 60. But I want to talk about protein and methionine a little bit separately, because I don't want you to freak out and think that this very healthy amino acid is really bad. So methionine is one of only 2 amino acids that contain sulfur. And these sulfur amino acids are very important because they are the ones that become glutathione, the body's own antioxidant. And these 2 amino acids, the sulfur, supports the liver in methylation and detox. So a lot of people who have been really sick, they actually get healthier by eating foods with high sulfur content. And what they're meaning then is they have foods with a lot of methionine and a lot of cysteine, because those are the only 2 that have that sulfur. And one of the reasons that we eat protein is to build tissue and build muscles. And if we don't have the proper balance, including methionine, then we can't do the kind of healing and growth and repair that we need to do. So it's not methionine itself that's the problem. It's the excess, and if we get imbalances, if we eat way too much of something and we're missing a lot of these nutrients that we talked about. So I don't want you to freak out about protein and start avoiding it and thinking that it's a bad thing because it has methionine. But I still want to point out a couple of things about food and how it is possible to get too much, but it's going to take a lot. So the foods that have the most per 100 gram of food is egg white, 1100 milligrams of methionine. Turkey breast has 1050 milligrams per 100 grams. Chicken breast has about 900 milligrams. So those are the 3 highest sources, 3 richest sources. Then when we look at meat and fish of most different varieties, we get between 700 and 850. And if we compare it to the whole egg, when we eat the egg yolk, which I always talk about, that it is maybe one of the most perfect foods in the world, but only if we eat the whole thing. So if we eat the whole thing, now you're getting a much better balance here, 400 to 450. Now, I want you to look at these foods and consider something. And I've talked about this a lot in my videos, that foods that have protein and fat are very filling. You get very satiated very quickly, and it lasts a long time. So if you look at this table, we have 3 foods, egg white, turkey breast, and chicken breast, that are very, very lean. And the people who eat them typically eat them because they're very lean. And I'm thinking bodybuilders who are trying to get up to hundreds and hundreds of grams of protein per day. This is one way that you can overdo it. So if you're trying to sort of artificially increase your protein intake and you're going for the egg white, the turkey breast, and the chicken breast, you could eat 300-400 grams of protein and definitely get too much methionine. Whereas if you stick with meat and fish and you get the juicy, tasty cuts that has a good amount of fat and you eat whole eggs, you're not really going to be on a high protein diet. Even carnivores are not on that much protein because most of what they're eating, 75% of the calories typically come from fat, which when you get that 20% or 15% fat in the ground beef, you eat your ribeye, you eat your whole eggs, then most of the calories are coming from fat and it's very filling, so you're not going to eat a tremendous amount. So don't freak out about methionine, just eat your meats and your vegetables, eat low carb, eat some nuts and seeds and the best variety that you can. And now let's talk about what you've probably been waiting for. How do we actually fix this? So we're going to talk about both of these two pathways where homocysteine gets recycled into methionine and the second where cysteine gets turned into glutathione. And the first one is called, number one is called remethylation, and the second one is called transsulfuration. And the names are not important, don't memorize them, it's just so we have something to call them to understand the difference. And these two different pathways, they require different nutrients to make them go forward. So number one, the remethylation pathway depends on 4 different nutrients. The first one is 5-MTHF, which stands for methyl tetrahydrofolate. It's simply the active version of vitamin B9. And then we also need some vitamin B12, and there's different versions you can get. The one with the best bioavailability is the methylated methylcobalamin. We also need some betaine, also known as trimethylglycine. And it is the heavy hitter in terms of methylation of donating methyl groups. And we also need some vitamin B2 or riboflavin. And for pathway number 2, the transsulfuration, we're looking for 3 nutrients. We need B6 or pyridoxine. We need an amino acid called NAC, which is just an absorbable form of cysteine. So NAC stands for N-acetylcysteine, which we can turn into glutathione. And the third one is another amino acid called L-serine. So they've done studies where they take one of these nutrients at a time in a study group. And when they compare to the placebo or the control group, then independently, each one of these nutrients will lower homocysteine. So one of these nutrients can do some good, but you really need all 7 of them to get the best support and the best conversion possible. But we have to get our terms straight also, because it's very confusing if you go out and read about this and you hear about folic acid and folate and methyl tetrahydrofolate. What's up with all that? How do they compare? Well, folic acid is a synthetic vitamin, and the FDA has put a limit on it, which we'll talk about the reasons, that you cannot get more than 1 milligram a day. But your body can't use that folic acid. It has to be converted to the MTFH, which of course the MTHFR enzyme is responsible for. And now we have it in the bioactive form. And why is that important? Because if you take too much folic acid, but you have a deficiency in your MTHFR gene, or even if you have a normal gene, but you take too much folic acid, now you're going to end up with unmetabolized folic acid, also called UMFA. And it's only very recently that they've realized this unmetabolized folic acid is a big problem. And here is why. Because it can block the MTHF receptors. So MTHF, that's the active folate that your body can use. the folic acid is the inactive form, but it still fits into the receptor. And once it's stuck in the receptor, now that receptor is taken out of play. It can't perform its work. So even if you have the active folate, it can't affect that receptor anymore because it's blocked. And this can cause many, many health problems, but just a few are that it can increase the risk of cancer, it can increase immune dysfunction, and it can cause neurological issues as well. So in other words, it's a fairly low toxicity level for the synthetic version of folic acid. And this is why the FDA has put a limit at only 1 milligram. But some people think that that 1 milligram limit also includes the active form, the MTFH, which does not. You'd have to take way much higher levels to have a problem with that because it's already in the active form. But now here is where this gets interesting, because even though the FDA has put a limit on it, FDA also requires the addition of folic acid to most processed foods. So this includes all wheat flour and all white bread. Because they process it, they remove so many B vitamins, and because of neural tube defects, if expecting mothers don't get enough folate, then they can develop neural tube defects on their baby. So that's one of the most important prenatal vitamins. And before they figured out this thing about the folic acid versus the MTHF, which is the active form, they used folic acid. But things move kind of slow, so now even 30, 40 years later, they still supplement with folic acid, the synthetic version, instead of the active form. So also in pasta, cereals, and baked goods, such as muffins, tortillas, and crackers, they are fortified with folic acid. And even nutrition bars and meal replacements, as well as baby formulas, all have to be fortified with folic acid. So with all this, it is pretty easy to get an excess of folic acid and therefore a buildup of unmetabolized folic acid. So just more and more reasons not to eat processed foods and not eat a bunch of grain. So while folic acid can have all sorts of problems, that's not the case with the MTHF. This is the natural bioactive form. That's the end result that your body turns it into from food that you would eat. And by doing this, it bypasses the MTHFR. Even if you have a problem with your MTHFR gene, the MTHF does not require conversion. It's already in its final form. And because it's in the active form, it can even cross the blood-brain barrier and get into all the cells in the body it needs to get to. It helps with DNA synthesis and repairs. And it's also very, very important in the homocysteine methylation and in reversing and converting the homocysteine back into methionine. And it also supports the body in detoxification and in the production of neurotransmitters. But let's get back to this model on how to best support your body to reduce homocysteine. And we said that there were 7 different nutrients that are required to optimally fuel and support both of these pathways. So does that mean that you have to get 7 different supplements? Well, there are some products on the market, but most of them will have 1 or 2 of these nutrients. Some better ones will have 3 or 4. Now, wouldn't it be nice if you could get a single supplement that had all 7 of these nutrients in a balanced ratio so that you just had to buy one thing? Well, when I went to look for one, there wasn't a product like that, which is why I decided to develop my own. And I did that under the Uvexia brand that I started a couple of years ago. So Uvexia is Greek and it's 2 parts. U means true. EU is true or good. And Vexia is wellness. So Euvexia means true wellness. And I really wanted the brand to stand for something because there were so many things out there. It's sometimes hard to even find things that do what they're supposed to. And the first product we put out was electrolytes. And I put out a product that's the most complete electrolyte product on the market. And we call that Ulite, meaning true electrolyte. So then for our second product, we developed one with homocysteine support. So naturally, we're going to call that UHOMO. But then I thought for a minute and I figured it maybe wasn't such a good idea after all. So instead, we decided to call it U-methyl-B. So true methylation and true B vitamins. And I'm very pleased with how the product turned out, both the beautiful container and, of course, the potent ingredients. So it is the most powerful, the most complete homocysteine support on the market today. It contains all the 7 nutrients that we talked about, which I believe it's the only product that does that, and they're balanced perfectly to support each other. And also, it is a 90-day supply, so in the long run, you end up spending less per serving and per day, even though it has all that stuff in it. I'll put a link down below if you want to check it out. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.